What's up guys, Spencer Sakurai here. So today we're talking about lenses, which are arguably one of the most important pieces of your cinema camera kit. One of the most important tools that you can use on set to create a look that defines the project and your style. Now, I have a lot of lenses in my kit, and recently I was shooting with some of them on set on a paid commercial that I was shooting, and I was running into some issues with some of the lenses that I normally shoot with. So I was excited. I wanted to do something a little bit more unique, so I shot on my Jonji 35mm T10. I was trying to kind of get that shallow depth of field and that mood and vibe that you can get from like a full frame camera, but on my Red Komodo without using the speed booster or anything like that. And that lens is really cool because it's small and compact, it's cine house, it just works. It does all the things you want it to do, but also without having too much of a sterile image or something that's too pristine and boring, really. But in doing so, I did this thing that I tend to do often, and maybe I should stop doing, is that when I feel like a location doesn't look very good, I end up shooting towards the window to add depth to the shot. But when you shoot towards windows on lenses that are a little bit less high quality, less pristine, you're going to get a lot of chromatic aberrations in those high contrast areas. And this is something you always need to consider when you are shooting with any lens. So I'm like, yeah, we're gonna get this mood, we're gonna get this blur, everything's gonna be like out of focus. It's really gonna make you focus on the subject because the thing that we were doing was about mental health. So I really wanted just to focus on the subject's eyes and just keep everything really separated from the background. But in doing so, there was a lot of chromatic aberration that showed up on the windows behind the subjects for a couple shots, and it really bummed me out. I've talked a lot on this channel about vintage lenses, and that's kind of where the Jonji came in. It really isn't a vintage lens, it's actually a new lens, but it's designed to kind of give you more of that vintage feel in the way that it opens so far up, gets so blurry. It's not supposed to be perfect by any means. It's supposed to have a little bit more character. And I like character. That's why, that's how you get a certain look for your images. You need the lens to do some of that work for you. Of course, what you put in front of your lens is the most important thing, but to add that little bit of extra sauce, that's where the lenses come in. And as I'm trying not to shoot as much now with filters, I used to shoot with my black Pro Mist a lot. I really don't like the blooming highlights like I used to. I really would just want to have more control over the image, keep it cleaner, but while still having some character. So normally when I do that too, I end up shooting on my Canon FD lenses, which are my vintage lenses, and I ended up using the 35mm f2 on a couple shots in this spot that I recently did. But this all just kind of prompted this idea. I was like, let me test every one of my lenses side by side and see how they all look. See how the bokeh renders, see how the color renders, see how sharp they are, and try to figure out what lenses I really want to use going forward. And I think this will be helpful to a lot of you. I have quite a few lenses here that we're testing. We are going to be testing my Mikey cinema lenses. They're the full frame lenses. They're T21 lenses. I've got the 24, 35, 50, and 85. And that set I've tested a lot on the channel before. You can probably go look at my other videos about those. Those are cool because they're cinema housed. They have all the proper stuff that you want when you're on set. They're reliable. That's where the value is added with those. They don't all perfectly match in color though, which is definitely a downside. When you're just trying to swing a lens real quick and have it match, the same scene, it's kind of a downside that the color changes a little bit. But the look always looks really nice on my speed booster or on a full frame camera. I've always just kind of liked those. Then also, we're gonna be testing these Irix lenses. I actually have the 45 T15 and then I have the 30 T15 to test. These were interesting to me because they were cinema housed. They're fairly inexpensive like the Mikeys, but they shoot at T15, so which we'll talk about more later, but T15 is interesting to me because then I don't have to use my speed booster. Now I have no problems using my speed booster, but honestly, like when I was shooting at T10 without a speed booster on my Jonji, the depth of field is so shallow. It's like you don't ever want to be more shallow than T10. So T15 on full frame would basically be like the equivalent, but really I think I would rather be at like T14 Super 35. That's kind of more of the sweet spot. It's like you have enough in focus, but you have enough of that stuff out of focus that looks nice and pretty and pleasant. And so that's why I wanted to test out these Irix lenses. Now they're in a similar price point to the Mikeys. They're in the similar price, a little bit more expensive than the Jonji, and the FDs kind of are in their own class of their own. Some of like my 24mm FD is worth like, I don't know, $6,000 now, but then my little 35 you can still get online for like $300. and that's the lens I shoot on mostly. Now, I don't normally get to shoot with my Canon FD lenses on my speed booster to get that full frame look and to get more shallow depth of field, because they are converted old lenses and the back elements actually extrude out the back when you're focusing, and they will actually hit the lens element on the speed booster, which is a no-go. I don't want to ruin the speed booster. I don't want to ruin my lenses, so I tend to shoot with those on Super 35, which we need to talk about Super 35 in full frame a little bit in this video. We'll get into it a little bit more later, because basically I want to prove, I think a lot of people still are confused on full frame versus Super 35, and I'm talking about more shallow depth of field and, you know, compression, and all these things are really kind of made up. Compression is a made up thing in a way, and there's a lot of misinformation on that. I might make an entire other video on that subject. There's lots of information online about it, but I still see people missing the mark on that, and we'll talk about that a little bit in this video. So we're also going to test all these lenses against the Sigma 18-35, the workhorse lens, the lens that everyone should have in their kit. Now, it's kind of remarkable, that lens. It's only like, what, $700, $800. Super 35 lens, which is fine, but it does shoot, you know, at f1.8, and it does zoom. And that lens is sharp, it's contrasty, it's saturated, and you'll be able to see that on the screen here in a bit. It's amazing how much nicer that lens is than a lot of my other lenses. Squarespace is an all-in-one platform to present your work online. Now, as a cinematographer, filmmaker, photographer, you're definitely going to need to put yourself online, and Squarespace is a great place to do that. I've been using Squarespace for over a decade now to build my website and update it, and it's super easy just to do that on the fly. They even have an app that you can monitor your website remotely from your phone. Say you put an online store on there, you can actually see those orders come in. And then what I really like is the contact form. If someone wants to reach out to me for a business inquiry, they can fill out the contact form on my Squarespace page that I custom built through Squarespace, and I can basically set it up however I want. And then when that comes into your email, it actually says that you got a form submission from Squarespace. So you know that you're getting direct connection from your clients through your website, and you'll be able to monitor that really easily. It's just a kind of good way of separating out your clients from the normal stuff that you see in your email. So if you're anything like me and you need to present your work online, you can just do that with Squarespace. Click the link in the description to get 10% off, and I want to thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Let's get into it. Let's look at all these lenses side by side and kind of compare them and see what's going on here. What we're really going to focus on is the bokeh, how the bokeh looks. We're going to look at sharpness to a degree. I couldn't get all of these perfectly sharp because I'm just doing this by myself, but I think for the most part, you're gonna be able to see what's going on. And then I shot into these windows behind me to make sure we had some high contrast to embellish that chromatic aberration. Now, when I was on that shoot recently, that commercial shoot, you know, I have the client, I've got the director, I've got everyone on this big monitor watching what we're doing. And all of a sudden there was this purple chromatic aberration, this fringing all over the screen. And the director was questioning it. He's like, what's going on here, bro? Like, why do you have this purple stuff all over the screen? Can you fix that? Luckily, I was the colorist on this project as well, and I was able to go in and pull out that chromatic aberration. But that was shooting on the Zhongji, and that was a bummer. And I really I was embarrassed a little bit. I didn't want to show up. You know, I'm charging a lot of money to be a director of photography and bring my kit and my camera and everything, and I feel like the chromatic aberration is not really acceptable. So that's the thing that I'm going to be really focusing on here, as well as the image overall and how it looks. We're going to talk about some of the pros and cons of each lens. Now, I'll try to go through this as quick as possible, but there's a lot to go over here, but I think it'll be really helpful for people that are trying to buy lenses or just seeing another perspective on what lenses might work for each project for you. So let's get into it. We're going to start here with the speed booster on the Komodo, because this is generally how I like to shoot. I like to try to get as close to that kind of full frame look as I can. That way I have the most options when it comes to my depth of field and my lens choices. Of course, one is not better than the other. I just like to have the ability, if I want to go shallower or I want to go wider, I just like to have the speed booster on for that. Because the speed booster is going to give us a 1.7x wider image than the Super 35 on my Red Komodo, which roughly puts, the Red Komodo has a pretty okay size sensor for Super 35. It's like a 1.3, 1.4. So you're really getting over full frame if you're shooting like the full sensor with the speed booster, which is cool. But I'm only shooting 16:9 here, so this is just kind of a standard Super 35mm crop. So this is the Mikey or Mica 50mm T2 with the speed booster. You can see here, looks nice separation from the background. I like the size of the bokeh circles in the background, which this is the thing that we need to talk about in the next video, but I will briefly talk about it here. And all aperture means, all the depth of field, the size of your bokeh, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about shallow depth of field. What we're really talking about here is the blur circles. So when, this lens is a T2.1, that's the aperture, that's the size of the iris. Well, that would be your f-stop. This is actually a t-stop, which is the transmission of light, but that's a whole other conversation. But you can see back here, I have these little things on my fridge that create these nice little bokeh balls, these little bokeh circles. So look at how big those are. So at T2.1, that's what they look like with the speed booster, which is really what that's doing is it's expanding your lens blur, your blur circles to be bigger. So T2.1 is actually somewhere in the T1.5, T1.8 range when we're talking about it with its speed booster, because we're adding an extra stop of light, which is going to make those circles look and appear bigger. So T2.1 is a different equivalent on Super 35. It's going to be smaller on Super 35. But what we can see here as well, so we got the separation. My skin tone looks pretty good. Nothing is perfectly white in the frame, but I do have white walls, so that's something to consider and look at as we go through here. You can see when I pull focus here, the high contrast area, so over my shoulder, definitely at the window, back there where all the highlights are at, you can see a little bit of chromatic aberration. So you're going to see some green or kind of magenta fringing on the sides there. Doesn't seem to be terrible on this one, but so it's a T2.1, but just for the sake of comparison for the rest of them, we're going to do a T2.8 as well, because that would be matching more of the Super 35 ones. And here it seems, pretty controlled. But as I recall, the micas definitely have chromatic aberration all the way down to like T8. It's not something that's just going to quickly go away. Just maybe more controlled as you stop down the lens. So here is the Irix 45mm T1.5. I'm roughly trying to get the same framing here, so I'm either walking forward or backing up, just so you can kind of see how the depth of field looks with the same framing, because that does make a difference. How close I am to the lens will make a difference. What's cool about these Irix lenses is they're a little bit on the cooler side. It seems a little bit more natural to the eye, whereas the micas seem to be a little bit, warmer, on the warmer side. Okay, then next we are going to be looking at the Mica 35mm this time at T2.1 with the speed booster, and I got closer to the camera, like I said, to make the frame size look similar, which should kind of change the bokeh in the background. But I didn't do T2.8 there because that really wouldn't make sense, because the depth of field wouldn't match any of the other ones. So now we're throwing on the 30mm, much wider, T1.5 with the speed booster. Once again, this is a little bit of a cooler image. A little softer. I think both of the Irixes are definitely softer in the center. We're always at T1.5, so that's going to be shallow either way. T2. You can also see the contrast on all these lenses. If you look at my shirt compared to the highlights, you'll be able to see how these contrast. How the contrast makes a difference on the lens, and that's why on some lenses that are more contrasty, you might want to use a low con filter, like a Pro Mist or like a satin or just a low con, to kind of open up those shadows a little bit. So now we're taking off the speed booster and we're just going to see what all the lenses look like at Super 35. So T15, that's going to make your image circle very large still on Super 35. So that's why the bokeh is still pretty big in the background. Okay, now we're back with the Mica 35 at T21. Can see a little bit of magenta fringing in the background over there, over my left shoulder on the right side of frame. And now we're going to the vintage lenses. Let's see how these older lenses compare. It's actually kind of wild how different they look, and this is why people like Canon FDs or old vintage lenses in general. Definitely some chromatic aberration. You can see it right over my shoulder again, over there on the highlights of the background. But look at the bokeh. The bokeh is much more open looking. It's much more desaturated. It has this it's called bubble bokeh to it. It has like a little ring. It's thinner. I think it's super pretty, and that's why I like shooting on these lenses. Also, you can tell the contrast is there's way less of it. There's way less contrast, which is a very interesting thing as well. So you don't have to worry about promise and stuff like that because you're already getting this this nice organic fall off and nothing is too crunchy. If you want to add more contrast in post or with your lighting, you can do that, but this kind of gets you that more open look right out of the gate. Really like it. It's also softer, a little bit hazier. So it's, like I said, it's kind of like there's already a pro mist on the lens if you're shooting with something more, pristine. So it's an f2, which doesn't directly translate to a T2 or a T21, but it's roughly the same. But you can tell by these circle sizes in the background what we're kind of getting from a depth of field standpoint. So definitely still some chromatic aberration that we'd have to work with these vintage lenses. So next we're going to go to the Sigma 18-35. Now this one should be much more controlled overall. And it's actually kind of remarkable. So if you look at the 35 on the Canon FD, it's also a little bit more blue, less yellow than the Micas, which I like. It's just a better starting point. Skin tones might be a little different though. Sigma, same thing. It's much more blue, much more cooler, much more neutral overall. It's actually a very nice lens. It's remarkable that this lens is so nice for its $750 price point. And it zooms. So we're doing f2 again, just to kind of similarly match rather than doing the f1.8. Very clean, very sharp, way more contrasty than the Canon FDs. Using autofocus here. Almost zero chromatic aberration. There's maybe a touch on my shoulder, but it's basically non-existent. Just did a little quick close-up here just to kind of show it. If you can see any chromatic aberration. So this is one of the cheapest lenses in the kit next to my FDs that I bought a long time ago. And it's, I would say, the most pristine lens out of all of these. So in reality, you show up, you shoot this into some windows, you're probably not gonna have chromatic aberration, you're probably not gonna have a client say something over your shoulder, director or client. So if you're more into that kind of risk-free, you might wanna shoot with Sigmas. But obviously, look at this. This image does not have the character that these other lenses have, and especially the Canon FDs. Okay, gonna move on. We're gonna pull it out to 24 millimeters so we can kind of compare that to the other 24 millimeters. Once again, looks nice. Optically, it honestly looks the same, even though we're zoomed. Now these would flare differently as well too, but I'm not really gonna compare flares here today. Now we're breaking out the creme de la creme here, the Canon FD 24mm f1.4 at f1.4. This is the vintage 24mm that's really hard to get. There's an aspherical version, and then there's just the regular L version, which I have. Like I said, these are probably worth like $6,000. Mine does have a scratch on the front element though, so I don't have any, can't really sell mine because I don't think anyone's gonna want it, even though for the most part it looks good still. It's very soft wide open. It's a bummer. Lots of chromatic aberration you can see over the shoulder and stuff. But look how low con it is. Look how open it is. Look at the bokeh. The bokeh has so much character compared to all of these other lenses. I mean, it just looks vastly different. Wide open. It's like gross but pretty all at the exact same time. This is at f1.4 though. This lens, my copy for sure, just falls apart at f1.4. But let's go to where I normally shoot it on set. This is at an f2. This cleans up so much of the image. It's not tack sharp in the center, but it's got this really nice fall off, and you can still find your focus. It's not like it's like bad. It's like I still shoot with this at f2 all the time on set. These are all EF converted, by the way, but you could easily get a Canon FD adapter and use that on your Komodo or mirrorless camera. Still a little bit of purple fringing back here on the window. I just love this lens. I love the colors. Nothing is too saturated, nothing is too contrasty, and everything looks so neutral and clean and like blue. Much more just like, I'm just gonna use the word, generally cinematic out of the gate. But I don't use this lens that often because it has a lot of quirks as an old lens, and I only use it in certain scenarios. All right, so now to compare that, we got the Mica 24mm T21 Super 35, no speed booster. Looks nice. The 24mm I think is one of the nicer lenses in the Mica kit. I use the 35 a lot, and I would feel like it's not even the nicest out of all of them. This one has just a little bit better, more neutral of an image. The bokeh is really interesting. It has the onion skinning in it, which a lot of people don't like, but it does give a little bit more character in the background, I think. So you can kind of compare that to the Sigma and the Canon FD to really see the difference in 24mm. Now we're at the Zhongji, the one I was talking about at the front end of this video. So this one's just a really cool little lens. It shoots at T10, which means you can get the most shallow depth of field imaginable at 35mm. But look over my shoulder, so much purple fringing happening, and this is what was happening on set, shooting into some windows. It's a bummer. But when you're not shooting into high contrast situations, this lens is super fun. It's way more contrasty than the FDs. It's much closer to like the Sigma from a contrast standpoint. It's not very clean blue. It's kind of in the middle somewhere, like a little bit warmer than like the Sigma or the FDs. You know, a little greener maybe. But it just gives this really, look at those bokeh circles in the background. They're much, much bigger. They're much closer to like the T21. Actually, they're bigger than the T21 on the Mica, probably closer to the T15. And we're not even shooting with the speed booster. And this is what I'm saying about shallow depth of field and frame size. You don't really need full frame to get shallow depth of field. You just need a bigger blur circle from your lens. But not a lot of T10 lenses out there, and especially not ones that are good. This one is fine. So you look in the background there, purple fringing. That's a bummer. This can get you in trouble on set. T14, I like this. This is kind of the sweet spot on this lens. little bit more in focus, maybe a hair less chromatic aberration. And it's just, you know, looks a little more natural overall. We're even going to do a T2 just for the sake of matching the other ones. So here's T2, and you can see that next to the Canon FD and the Mica. From what I can tell so far, the Irix kind of has the most, like, checks the most boxes. The Bokeh's a little weird, has a little like onion skinning going on in it, and at T15 it is soft. It definitely doesn't, besides the shallow depth of field, it just doesn't really ever seem like it's like really sharp. I even misfocused a little bit because I couldn't really find the focus all the way. So it's going to be softer, more like a vintage lens. So in a way, the Irixes are kind of like in the lead from like a overall standpoint. So here's a 45 T15. The only thing is it's really messing with my mount on my lens. Like when I pull focus, it's like moving everything. So look at that. There's a little bit of fringing on the left, but if you look on the right where most of them were happening over my shoulder, it's really not happening. There's really not a lot of chromatic aberration. And then at T15 Super 35, 45 looks really good. It's a little longer than I would like to shoot, but it does all the things. Shallow depth of field, cinema house, less chromatic aberration, decent looking bokeh, not too sharp, and not too warm of a lens either. The Irix is kind of interesting. T20, just for the sake of looking at it. And then what we're going to do here at the end is we're going to throw up the Mikey. So these are the two lenses I have. I don't own these Irixes. I'm just using these right now. I have the Mica and I have my Zhongji and my other FDs, obviously. So I'm wanting to see like frame size wise. 50 and 35 are basically the same, like 50 on a full frame or 50 with the speed booster versus a 35 on without the speed booster or on Super 35. Those are basically the same compression and focal lengths when you're comparing them. So I'm putting them side by side here to see like how much better the Mica looks. Like, is it worth owning these Micas still in my kit? What's the purpose of having both of these lenses, basically? And how shallow is it? Is it compared to the T10, T14, on the Zhongji? If I own these Irixes, this would be a little bit of a different conversation, but the Micas seem a little bit nicer than the Irixes when it comes to contrast and sharpness, but depends what you want. So, conclusion here. I don't know if there is one. I think it's really, I wanted you to look at all these and kind of decide for yourself what fits your needs. And really, when it comes to lenses, sometimes it's nice to have multiple in your kit because it really depends on what your project is. If you're doing some corporate work, throw in the Sigma. Don't let anything get weird and out of focus and gross. But if you're doing like a really moody, fun commercial and you want some character and vibe, well, then you throw on the vintage. You've heard this before, but here you can actually see it practically speaking. And do you want to deal with chromatic aberration? So after doing this, I think what I want to do now is actually play with the idea of a pristine lens. I want to see if I can control things. Like maybe I get a pristine lens and maybe I get some filters to go in the front of it. I know a lot of people use Sigmas. I just think the Sigmas are like too flat looking. Like there's the contrast and the saturation is so much. Even if I put a filter on it, I feel like I wouldn't be able to get close to the FDs and like how they look. And this is for a commercial situation, but also for narrative. Like with narrative, my two favorite like people in the filmmaking world are probably Roger Deakins, obviously from a cinematography standpoint, and then David Fincher, who's not necessarily a cinematographer, but he might as well be. Both of these filmmakers shoot with the most pristine lenses they can get. So, you know, Roger Deakins usually shooting on master primes, no filtration. Then you have David Fincher, who's usually shooting on the Lights Summicron lenses, which are one of the most pristine lenses you can buy as well. And Fincher just adds whatever he wants in post if he wants it to look different. And I think this is really interesting. I think the idea of like not having perfect control and being able to change things later or add filtration makes a little bit more sense practically speaking. But that's for narrative, because you just want things to look more natural and you don't want weird bokeh on narrative all the time unless you're doing something that's really wild and the project calls for it, of course. But for me, I want to play with this. So what I think I'm going to do next is I think I'm going to order a couple lenses of the Zeiss Milvis family, which we'll do a whole video on. I'm also going to get some filters and test that in front of the Milvis. Now the Milvis is kind of underrated. I think it's a lens that's easily converted to cinema. They like literally make gears for it, Zeiss does, and there's stepless aperture rings and stuff like that. Now this lens is supposed to be very pristine, not quite like the Zeiss Otis. That is like, they call it the mini master prime. I don't want to pay for those. That's expensive. Whereas the Milvises are like $800 to $1,300. So I want to try those out and see like what a really clean lens looks like, and maybe I add a little low con filter to it to see if I can get it to kind of get in the middle here. You know, obviously you can still shoot Sigma, and maybe you'll order a Sigma lens too to try out against the Milvis. But the Milvis seem interesting. The Zeiss optics are, the micro contrast on the Zeiss has me intrigued. So we are going to get those in for another video later. So stay tuned, subscribe if you want to see that. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions about lenses, leave those in the comments below for sure, because I will be sure to answer those, because I find lenses very interesting, and I really think it's a big part of your cinematography identity or the identity of the project. The lenses can really aid to that. All right, that's it for me. Until next time, guys, as always, I'm Spencer Sakurai. See ya.